Jeffway in a second.
Yes.
As I think I say at the beginning of all these meetings, if you have any interest in a Millbrook Historical Society calendar, right, printed by the Bank of Millbrook, talk to Jonathan. He's the guy right behind the camera. He brought some extra ones. These are great keepsakes. I know it's April, so you probably like have all your calendar needs met at this point in the year, but if you want one, talk to Jonathan. I'll just give a quick plug for our May program, which is about the history of Millbrook Rotary. Right? Some of you probably have connections to Millbrook Rotary over the years. Right? And so that's going to be coming up in May. We've also got in early June, if you like to plan ahead, a program that we're co-sponsoring with the library. I think it's on June 5th, if I remember the date correctly. And there's a guy coming in who is an expert on antique bottles. Right? So I know we got the bottle shop, right, down by the Ensaconic there. It's not that guy, it's a different guy. But he's going to come in and talk about antique bottles and how you can kind of figure out how old they are and where they came from and all of that. So if people have stuff in their collection, that could be a good thing to attend as well. Just a very brief introduction for Bill Jeffway. He is one of the kind of towering figures in local history, the executive director of the Dutchess County Historical Society. And what I really appreciate about Bill is that, you know, there's a lot of kind of obvious aspects, kind of famous aspects to Dutchess County history. And Bill knows all that stuff, but he is interested in going kind of beneath that and finding out kind of the history of people who maybe haven't gotten a lot of attention over the years, communities that haven't really been the focus of historical research. And that's what you're going to hear about tonight. Right? Yeah. So I very much look forward to it. Thank you.
Very good. Thanks a lot. Now, some people in the audience, like David Greenwood, I may need to rely on for some correction or update or amplification. I'm in an august crowd here. But I'm very pleased to have so many people, and I want to ask you in a minute if some of you why some of you have come, what motivates you to come, and if there are certain questions I can ask during the presentation, because sometimes, and of course we'll have questions at the end, but I sometimes like questions at the beginning. But while you think about that for a moment, I'll just say that I moved to Dutchess County about 20 years ago. There is a blue and white historical marker from 1935 on my road that celebrates the burial of Chief Crow, and supposedly an Indian. And it says that the last burial happened in about 1850. But a woman in the town I live in, Milan, a historian in the 1970s, wrote that that was actually a black burial ground. And she guessed at some of the names. And I did a little more research and found it was a black burial ground. Former enslaved persons of the Martin family in Red Hook. Buried there was Jacob Lyle, who owned the Little Slubber. He was an American Revolutionary War veteran. And so under this state marker, as well-intentioned as it was a kind of misleading statement. The crow comes from the fact that the lot was known kind of dismissively as Crow Lot, being a black burial ground. And so I feel like when we look at local history, the most profound things you can learn is how it changes generation to generation, because the facts remain the same, but our interpretation of the facts change over time. In part, I think, because we give ourselves permission, or we're able to deal with the truth that we're finding with these facts. This Vassar College professor, Lucy Maynard Salmon, often spoke about the importance of rewriting history, which sounds like the wrong thing to do. But she said, it depends. If you're rewriting history to get to a closer truth, pushing away biases, new sources of information, it becomes the most important job to rewrite history. So part of what I guess I say enjoy doing is not, I still find it hard to say rewriting history, but I would say better understanding a truthful history, because of that extra dimension that asks, well, why have we been afraid to talk about that, or why did we prefer an Indian burial ground to a black burial ground, and so on. So I work on the research committee of Celebrating the African Spirit. It's a Poughkeepsie-based group that looks at raising the profile of Africans and their descendants, largely in Poughkeepsie, but have them elsewhere. and I serve on the External Advisory Committee of Vassar College's Inclusive History Initiative. So this is definitely an area of interest to me. So if you had a minute, could anyone just tell me what prompted you to come or what you hope to learn and would like to make sure I address? Yes, sir.
I, 40 years ago, used to be a deputy sheriff down in Albemarle County, Virginia. And one of the things that I looked at here in the library many years ago was a small periodical, The History of Dutchess County's 8 Historic Black Churches.
Oh, yeah.
It turns out the one closest to my home, Central Baptist, was founded by freed slaves from Fluvanna County, Virginia, the county next to where I was a deputy sheriff.
Cosmo, right? That's the kind of amazing coincidences that you find that it's really a small world and all these things are interconnected. One of the reasons I have a smattering of stars is the more I've looked into this, the more I see connections to Australia, connections to the 15th Amendment, national issues and global issues. So I'm not entirely surprised that you ran into that kind of coincidence. Thank you. Anyone else, just to warm things up? Okay, I'm on my own then. I've actually done this a little differently than usual. Because I had a wonderful couple of sessions with Allison and Robert at the Millbrook Historical Society archives, looking at local Black history archives, I kind of split this into 2 parts. The first part are some of the broader themes I generally talk about, but the second part is a kind of work in progress look at some of the archives related to Black history at the Millbrook Historical Society, so that's a little bit more of a sampler approach. The national ambition, the best example I like to give, we do a lot of research around the New Guinea community in Hyde Park. It was a community that grew very quickly by a factor of 5 before the Civil War, right, when we had the Fugitive Slave Law Act, and people from the South were trying to escape to Canada. Quite a few ended up staying in Hyde Park. And we have some documentation that there were elderly persons, not necessarily well educated, who walked to Poughkeepsie to celebrate the adoption of the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. I'll remind everyone that the 13th abolished slavery, the 14th made blacks people, and the 15th guaranteed their equal rights, equal protection under the law. And we're a little bit more conversant with and aware perhaps of the Constitution these days, but when I spoke 4 and 5 years ago, it was really I would ask people, when was the last time we had a parade around an amendment and celebrated it? And my point was that even the most average person in that New Guinea community knew that they were fighting for profound national change, like the 15th Constitutional Amendment, the thing that would guarantee equal rights. So when there are voting rights issues or voter suppression issues, it all goes back to the 15th Amendment. So I'd like to point out these stories that I think even the most common person was aware that there had to be fundamental change. The Civil War, 2% of the US population died. That would be the equivalent of 7 million people today. The deadliest war in American history. So if you think of the cost of that war and what was extracted from it, and then we look at ways that it started to slip back. Global reach, we just have a wonderful example. I actually got a call from Australia, and I didn't know this story, but she was telling a story that she had investigated her ancestry and traced it back to the town of Washington. And that her ancestor, who we'll meet, was one of 2 brothers, and she's actually now identifies as a white person. Her family's seen as white, but her ancestors are black. She has an interesting story, and about the Alfred Brown, who went from the town of Washington to Australia and created a different type of family. That's a kind of example of global reach. And when we start looking especially at the Quaker community's involvement in whaling and the rediscovery of communities like the New Guinea community in Bridgeport, Connecticut, that was a very large whaling community, and of course the Quakers are involved in Nantucket. We begin to see that there was a big black maritime diaspora that was much more involved in the Underground Railroad and in arguing for freedom than perhaps has been talked about. So we'll look at some examples of that. And then the second half, I just have those kind of little bite-sized examples which are almost like a work in progress. So, new learnings and perspectives. It's kind of talking about what I've learned over the past 20 years as we've unearthed things, but there's been an acceleration of interest in the past 5 years, past 10 years, and what we find is nuance, greater complexity, interconnectedness, grayness. That's why I have this little spattering of the intergalactic stars. And so it's a little less comfortable if the world isn't in black and white, but it is, to quote Lucy Maynard Salmon, a lot more truthful and therefore worth getting to know. Among the nuances, I highly recommend keeping an eye out for Levada Nahon. She's the Director of African American Interpretation for New York State Parks. Levada Nahon speaks frequently and helps kind of architect the larger narrative of what she feels is important statewide in terms of the African American story. And I know one of the things that she has been putting a light on is to not diminish the role of Quakers as abolitionists. But when you start to look at source material, right, and the pursuit of truth requires we get to source material and see what it really says. We find examples where Quakers professed a wish to prohibit slavery, but when it came to manumission, and when you look at manumission records from the 1770s, they were some decades off, and it might not have been as quick as we think. Black leadership in the Underground Railroad, I referenced a bit. Black captains, black boat person on the Hudson River and the Poughkeepsie Hotel, the chambermaids, and you think of the large number of black men and women involved in that kind of transportation. We began to see not necessarily what you'd call a black-led Underground Railroad. Ms. Nahon likes to describe it as a set of Underground Railroads with an S that was far more complex and far more integrated in black and white and far less planned out in advance. And so while the story of the white Quaker helping the black freedom seeker is part of the story, you start to see that actually there are bits and pieces that are a lot more complex and interracial in terms of how freedom seekers were handed off. Black women's leadership, you'll find, I wasn't surprised to find, but that in Washington, as I was looking at the period before the Civil War when blacks were trying to buy property, there was a time when property requirements for men to vote were in place only for black men. So in 1841, New York State repealed property ownership voting requirements for white men, but not black. So property ownership became important for the black community for that reason. At the same time, there's a disproportionate number of black women buying property. And I see this at Oak Street, which is the free black community in Rhinebeck. There were 3 women, one of whom bought a 3-plot wide lot as a subdivision. And we can see across the county black women buying property disproportionately. If I look at the tax rolls in the town of Milan in 1872, every single itemization is a man, that one woman, Ellen Jackson, a black woman that owned 108 acres. And in Washington, we'll see adjacent to the poorhouse was some breaking off of land in slivers for blacks, and a woman came to own one of those properties. So there are interesting ways that black women offered leadership through property ownership and through a focus on education. The other thing we're learning a lot about is the reverse Underground Railroad, I call it. We all know 12 Years a Slave, but it was a lot more common than we might think. So we have perhaps a dozen documented instances of named persons. For example, in Poughkeepsie, a young boy being asked to come on a ship to taste some oranges. He gets on the ship, he's kidnapped and sold into slavery. And we know that because 10 years later he escaped and told his story. There was this kind of illegal kidnapping going on. Then there was kidnapping going on that had a veneer of legality, especially in New Jersey. There was a particular judge who, under the law, which said that if certain blacks wanted to go into slavery in the South, I'm not exactly sure why they would want to, but that could happen. Because for all the good that was happening in the North with the abolition of slavery, all it meant was those property prices of those human beings was going down, and there was pressure to just sell them to the South. And this reverse Underground Railroad, the kind of kidnapping or secretive move of people into enslavement, is much bigger than we had thought. The other thing, I have just 3 examples, but they're kind of interesting examples of white women taking refuge in black communities. In these instances that I've discovered, the white women are victims of abuse at home, and one woman even found employment as a seamstress at a black couple's house that she lived in. But we found 3 instances where, we always think of the whites helping the black freedom seeker, but these are instances where the black communities, by dint of their isolation, became desirable places for some women who needed protection. And so I'm kind of literally just laying out the things we've learned, and I'll give you a couple of examples. And so what I find interesting about the persons that we're going to look at is that we see people who are living local, day-to-day lives like we all have to do. But on top of that, they're thinking, what are the national needs? What's going on politically, nationally that I have to address? And how do I fit into a global network? And should I go to Australia, or should I do something else? So, oh yes, I said I work in the broad themes part and then the local discoveries. I'd just like to remind everybody, I find Dutchess County so interesting because it's at such a crossroads. It's halfway between New York City and Albany, which really means it's halfway between the cusp of the Atlantic and the Mohawk River, later the Erie Canal. We are right in the middle of what was the backbone of the Empire State economy. And so we had first the Albany and New York areas, even with the Dutch filled in first, and we later got settled by Dutch, English, and enslaved Africans kind of coming in from the northwest and south. And as you well know, Quakers coming from New England, Nantucket, and Long Island. And I believe this sets up a really unique dynamic in New York State history, because you can find a town, Hyde Park's a particularly good example, because in one town I can introduce you to a J.K. Paulding, who was a national published pro-slavery white supremacist author, a recognized national voice. And I can show you, introduce you to national voices who are abolitionists, the Garmo father and daughter, I'm thinking of particular, and a vibrant free black community. So you really had, within small spaces within Dutchess County, the dynamic of these national voices that were at once, there were some very powerful white supremacist points of view expressed by people like Samuel Morse in Poughkeepsie, when he was living in Poughkeepsie in the 1850s, and J.K. Paulding in Hyde Park. So Dutchess County would have been a kind of hotbed of the most extreme arguments for and against slavery, and was perhaps as a consequence a very vital place where free black communities evolved. And the only thing I'd say, in addition to the 6 or so very distinct free black communities that we've come to understand, is that there was a much greater distribution of blacks in individual homes, which you'd find in the town of Washington as you would in Dutchess County. So there was a much bigger rural black population. But I think this makes Dutchess County very particular and interesting and important. So I mentioned the Oblong Meeting House. The story goes, built in 1763, that in 1766, slave ownership was banned. But there are 2 stories. Well, there's one in particular that comes out of the same meeting house the same year. Nathan Birdsall was the first Quaker to arrive in Dutchess County, or is known as that. And his son was convicted and ejected from Quakers for selling a free black man into slavery. So there's that reverse Underground Railroad again as early as 1769. Father and son were both accused, but the son ended up being identified as the person who was really responsible for that. Nathan Birdsall Sr. remains within the Quakers. So just an interesting dynamic even within just that meeting house. Slavery in Dutchess County was as difficult as anywhere. These are some ads from the Poughkeepsie Journal, and the top, a Negro boy for sale, age 16. This is in 1810. And then a runaway ad from 1812. There's almost an indignancy from the owner, Spencer Stafford, saying, and she took with her an infant female, 9 months old. He was almost indignant about her doing that. But it's amazing to me to think of what it would take for a woman to take her child and on foot and without resources try to find freedom. This is a contemporary depiction. We don't often see it, but this gentleman does historic paintings and allows me to use this picture because we don't often see blacks in rural roles, and yet it was quite common. This is from the County Historical Society collections. Bills of sale for enslaved persons, like this happens to be the Brett family from Fishkill, of course. It's kind of extraordinary to have them named among horses, cattle, sheep, and hogs. In this case, I guess there were 3 adults and a young boy sold in language that shows us how they were really legally property. And this is the kind of source material we'd like to look at to get a sense of what truthfully happened. Keep an eye out for people from Maryland. I was amazed to see that here we have a depiction of a perhaps integrated Underground Railroad. But Maryland, just below Philadelphia, Philadelphia being such an important point for the Quakers. Right, it's often said that Dutchess County had the largest Quaker population outside of Philadelphia. Maryland is very close to Philadelphia and yet had very oppressive slavery laws. So when you look at the roots of the Underground Railroad, you'll see quite a bit of activity around Maryland, and then a good deal up the Hudson River, and then it doesn't show it, but of course inland along the eastern part of Dutchess County. This is what I mean about maybe a little more balance in how we talk about the Underground Railroad. The Quaker route is probably better understood and known, but if I look at something we have in our county collections, it looked like work notes from the 1840s for someone developing a census. And there were something like a dozen black men and women working just at the Exchange Hotel in Poughkeepsie. The Exchange Hotel was at the foot of Main Street and would have been the main stopping point for steamboats. So stewards, boatmen, chambermaids, and so on. So when we start to look even at blacks, one gentleman in particular became a boat captain along the Hudson River, we begin to see that there are a lot more activities along the Hudson River than we might have thought. I am going to skip that. This is the example. I don't expect you to read it, but I will read it for you. This is an example of, this is from the Dutchess County records on courts. And this is a story of a Mary Mott of Poughkeepsie. And she was born around 1782, and she had married at the age of 16 William B. Mott, a man of considerable property, but jealous disposition, a fancy chair painter. They had 4 children. But Mary left her husband, and she says in sworn testimony that she left him for ill treatment in New York in March of 1809. She came to Statsburg and made her way to Gay's Tavern just north of Poughkeepsie in Hyde Park. She stayed there before moving to the town of Clinton. And in the home of a former servant, Mary was confined for some time, and she was seeking some relief. She ended up in a black family, a couple, man and woman, who ended up providing not just cover for her, but employment as a seamstress. And so she's testifying here to get some relief from the overseers of the poor, but it's an amazing story, a detailed story of how she moved from place to place, but ultimately found refuge and employment at a black couple's house. These are a couple of examples of kidnapping that was going on. J.W. Pennington in 1841 wrote about this boy, James Goman, who had 10 years prior. This is the young boy I was talking about. Someone offered him some oranges, he was intrigued, and he ended up on the boat. And this story was published. He was taken to Louisville, Kentucky and sold. They even knew who he was sold to, a John Cutter. So John Pennington, who ends up becoming a teacher in Poughkeepsie and a strong leading abolitionist, tells this boy's story in 1841. If the boy hadn't escaped, we wouldn't necessarily have known that story. There's another interesting example. In 1832, we have the court records showing that Isaac Butler was actually taken to court, and we don't have the verdict, but Isaac Butler was accused of, he ran a livery in a stagecoach to Sharon, Connecticut. But he was accused of getting permission of a young black boy's father to take horses to Virginia for some sort of exchange or trade. And you have to remember that's 1832, so it's 30 years before the Civil War. And Isaac Butler came back and said to the father, "I'm sorry, your boy ran away. He's not here." Well, the boy got up to some mischief in trying to escape, ended in front of a judge in Virginia. And although he was about 10 years old, he managed to say to the Virginia judge that he knew, and he named judges in Poughkeepsie, well-known ones like Emmett and others. The Virginia judge, sensing that something was not right, wrote to the judge in Poughkeepsie. The judge in Poughkeepsie wrote to the Virginia judge saying that boy is free, and they end up bringing the boy back, and the plot is foiled. But that's probably one of the more documented cases that we have. And like I said, we've just unearthed now the transcript, the court transcript, which shows a very difficult time for the boy, I'll say. And so, anyway, that's an example of that. Okay, I spent a lot of time when I was first talking about black history in Dutchess County saying, we're not the South. We don't have plantations. We don't have big slave quarters. Guess what? Well, we kind of did, but it's a small portion. It tended to be earlier in our history, in the 18th century, but there are now, we have evidence and reports of slave quarters at a Livingston house called Altamont in Red Hook, at Clove Valley, at the Amy House. Slave quarters is described as across from the house. And then not so far from here, the Everett Plantation. And Niels Larson did a wonderful article in our County Historical Society yearbook on the landscapes in this area. And he did a review of Smithfield Valley's past. And there's this particular lot. This is when the patents were kind of broken up into the 9 partners and everybody got a 900 or so acre chunk. And if you compare it today, to the maps we're talking about now, the owner of this land kind of broke off half of it and kept this, and this became almost like a southern plantation in scale. And this is the area where slave quarters are described as having been like stalls in the basement of a house. The other two are slave quarters built externally. Typically, an enslaved person in Dutchess County living in a house with a small family would have been either in the basement or the attic, usually without light. So, but there are now these three examples we've found where there was a big enough slave community to build slave quarters. And as I say, that tended to happen earlier in the 18th century, and less so into the 19th. Okay. Whew. Those are the big picture things. I'm just going to take a breath and see if you have any questions about the big picture things, and then I'll talk through some stories of the town of Washington. Oh, good. Let me start here. Yeah.
Mrs. Mott, who left her husband, was she white or
Yes.
black?
Yeah, I'm sorry, no, she was white.
Okay.
Yeah, I meant that to be an example of
Okay.
white refuge. But we have other examples. A woman from a Darling family from Rhinebeck ended up saying that she had to seek the comfort and aid of colored persons and colored servants when she was seeking to protect herself. So yeah, I meant to be clearer. Thank you for that. Yes, sir.
The Smithfield Valley, that would have been what, farming, agricultural?
Yeah,
Right,
yeah,
okay.
yeah. Because there is a river that goes right down there, so it looks like they farm both sides of the river. Anyone else? Oh, good.
Around how many people would have been enslaved at the Smithfield Valley plantation?
Oh, so they use language like reported to be 30 or so, and it always seemed high to me. But I found a book that describes the marriage of a member of the Smith family in Armenia, and this was a very wealthy part of the county. Very well connected, very wealthy. And I was reading about the presents that this woman was giving, or was given for her wedding. And she had 3 or 4 or 5 enslaved persons just for herself. So I think I could imagine how you could get to 20 or more. And that's kind of the number from the others that show up. Oh, anything else before? So these are just some photos from a visit to the Millbrook Historical Society. And I'm fascinated by postcards. And it looks like the woman there, Ms. Evelyn Duncan, loved to get postcards. And so there are several hundred postcards. And we'll talk about him a little bit, but this particular one is from John Britton, right? Some of you know the story of John Britton, who was brought back after the Civil War from Tennessee, a starved boy who was brought back and had a good, long, and productive life in the town of Washington, and was a successful gardener. And these postcards, for anyone who wants to dig in and start organizing them, are like an index to the history of the town. They're really pretty fascinating. I'm happy with just the pictures sometimes. Here is Evelina Duncan gets one that says something like, nice view of the wings, very pretty view showing the front, and it's Shadow Lodge, residence of J. Morgan Wing. So they would send postcards to each other, hamlet to hamlet, or say, well, we're coming to dinner tomorrow. So I love these because they're so personal and intimate. There is some of the later postcards, they go into the 1940s to a Mr. Clarence Anthony, and this one is dated 1941. There's several opportunities for high school graduates with good grades. Miss Lucy Graves will be at the Central Baptist Church next Sunday at 1. Try to get some people there. And I just put a picture of Lucy Graves because she became a very well-known leader in Poughkeepsie of a local black community center. She became very close to Eleanor Roosevelt, And she was active, especially in the 40s and 50s, in creating local change. She was involved particularly in employment and labor, but she also was personally denied some theater tickets in the town of Clinton, and that became a bit of a court case too. So it was interesting to see her mentioned, because she's a real icon in local Black history. And then this is to Sarah Duncan, dear mother, the children and I will be home on Wednesday. Viola, and you do start to do a little work on ancestry, and I don't see Viola there, but I think I thought I was getting near her. And oh, I know, I wanted to mention, this one is postmarked Bridgeport, and there seem to be a number of members in Bridgeport. And remember what I was saying about what we're discovering about Bridgeport was just how big the New Guinea maritime community was in Bridgeport. So I'd love to know more about the local families' connections to Bridgeport, and whether I'm sure they would have been involved in what was the New Guinea community there, and whether that was, there was some sort of maritime adventure there or not. Dear Grandma, this was just that the colors don't quite come out from a map, so you're going to have to trust me that some of these I thought were just nice to look at. Your loving little boy. Very personal messages. Another one to Bridgeport. Hello, Mother, from Viola. I think she's talking about going to a dance or see you in Bridgeport. There's something going on in Bridgeport that would be really interesting to understand the dynamic of. And Fisher's Island. Oh yes, and people, I think this is the one. It says, we know you like postcards, basically, is what it says. So we're sending you one from Fisher's Island. So you start to get a sense of this woman, Sarah Duncan. Merry Christmas. Okay, you get the idea. Even from Pine Plains. So let me get through those. I wanted to just show a few pictures. And then as I talk about some of the substance behind the people we're going to see, and many of the photographs are not identified, but they're mostly all from the Millbrook Historical Society. I'm going to draw from two other sources that really ended up intersecting quite well with the Millbrook Historical Society's work. One, in the County Historical Society collection, we have an extraordinary transcript of a diary of Benson Lossing's son, Thomas Sweet Lossing, thank you. And he talks about the Black community in Chestnut Ridge in a really interesting way, and in a very detailed way. And there are very specific connections. When we look at John Britton's wife, she's a descendant of a person who's described in detail by Lawson. So I'll pull from that. And then the other thing, there was a woman named Manet Fowler who lived in Rhinebeck in the 1950s, affiliated with Bard College. And not a Fowler, despite all the Fowlers that are local. I don't think there's a local Fowler connection. But she's was a nationally known and respected anthropologist. And she did interviews among blacks in the early 1940s. It must have been on behalf of the federal government, because it says, they're typed written with her handwritten notes, defense attitudes among Negroes. And she did a series of interviews, Poughkeepsie, Beacon, and then rural areas, which included Millbrook, to get a sense of whether blacks would step up to the war. Right? Because we had World War I, they served very well, they come back, they get the Red Summer, right? The most violent racial activity to date at that time in 1919. And their rights didn't get advanced to the degree they thought, and it looks like she was doing some research to quote-unquote look at the quote-unquote readiness of Negroes to participate in the war. So I'll draw from the Lossing work and the Fowler interviews. But this I like, because it just gives us a sense of who these people were. think a good number of cases we haven't figured out necessarily who they are, but these are all from the Millbrook collection. A good number like this are labeled like Ada Jackson, daughter of Bill, and I think it's Phoebe Jackson. But I love these because they give you a sense of the people, and they go right into the 50s, even sometimes a little later. This is interesting, the Millbrook Colored Republican Club in 1944. So that's quite interesting that late. We all know that blacks were largely Republicans because of Abraham Lincoln. And that was supposed to start changing by the time we got to FDR. But it looks like it had not entirely changed. And I know there was an interesting dynamic where Jane Boland, the first black woman judge in the United States from Poughkeepsie, had to first, she was appointed by Republicans, but then had to navigate Democrats. And I think, you know, there's an interesting story. It's like a Rosetta Stone to the story of party affiliation for blacks at that time. So I just put it up as a curiosity. And then there's this wonderful book, was presented by P. Thorne to Sarah, is it Sanders? I can't remember now. But anyway, it's a record of what she bought of John Britton, 9 pounds of pork, and 11 pounds of pork later, and these are all references to John Britton, we mentioned earlier. And so these are wonderful insights into the day-to-day lives of these people. There's the famous Lyle report from around World War I, right? It's, I think it's around is it just before World War I?
Yeah, 1913.
1913. This Lyle report looks at the different communities within the town of Washington and Millbrook. And this is interesting because it says this is a black crook home, open, well, unsanitary surroundings, lack of community pride. Such homes often become physical and moral menaces. And I haven't quite figured out where that is necessarily. But it's hard to imagine that going on. But you had instances like this, here's the open well, with this kind of shanty-like living. There was a great deal of this in Hyde Park when it had that population explosion. But obviously, these are not great ways to live. And this is a section of Black Crook. Moral and physical degenerates find shelter in such surround. Here, vice breeds unmolested. And, you know, I think those were the days where you kind of blamed the circumstance, or held it accountable at least in some way. And then, sometimes the thrifty looking are shiftless. I don't know why they necessarily chose that poor black family to say that. The kids look very cute, but anyway, those are interesting dynamics. They're looking kind of like unsure. And here's the home of a thrifty colored man. He owns and runs an automobile passenger and express line to Poughkeepsie. So I think, you know, it was laying out kind of the moral guideposts for self-improvement, which, you know, can be a good thing, channeled the right way. And what happens when you start to bring in these other things like the Mene Fowler interviews, the Thomas Sweet Lossing transcriptions, is you can start to figure out who they are. Remember, the man in that house, they said, had a passenger company. And if we go to the Mene Fowler notes from the 1940s, she interviews a Mrs. V in South Millbrook. Mrs. V is the sister of Mr. C, who died within the last year. These would be relatively easy to figure out, I just haven't. First person to operate a public automobile agency and bus service between Millbrook and Poughkeepsie, and he's black. As a matter of fact, Mrs. V says her brother's transportation service was the first and the only such agency in Millbrook. The girls at the Bennett School are still being transported in C buses, though since Mr. C's death, the service has been sold to one of his former helpers. For the general public, however, The township now operates the bus service, and the remnants of Mr. C's agency are confined mostly to private calls. Mrs. V with Mrs. C lives in a beautiful colonial cottage on the top of a hill, and like most of the colored women in Millbrook, she says she and Mrs. C, quote unquote, do laundry for the wealthy white families surrounding them. At the time of the interview, Mrs. C was away serving a dinner party for a state senator who lives nearby. I don't know who that was, but Mrs. V was helpful and showed her their immaculate laundry house, equipped with washing machines and built-in tubs and the like, and built a separate establishment in their backyard. So basically, these women were running a business out of the home. So I think now we go back to the Millbrook Historical Society archives, and we find this clipping which describes a tribute to a worthy citizen, and we learn all about the story of this gentleman whose name I can't find. But anyway, this is the story, the story of the passenger company that's involved with Mrs. V and Mrs. C. So I have to apologize. Some of this work is like a work in progress. I've discovered that, and I see it's connected to that, but I haven't necessarily fleshed it out into a complete narrative. But let's see. Mr. Collins, and he is Mr. C. There you go. Okay. So that's kind of when the history gets fun and the dots get connected. Yes, sir.
I know that in the post-Civil War, pre-World War I time period, Reconstruction included, that there were many instances down south where, for the black community, some black life insurance companies were formed which survive today if they weren't gobbled up by Metropolitan Life and all of them. And then there were some black banks that were founded back during that time as well. Did you encounter in your research any affluence in the black community here in Dutchess County?
That's a good question. It's interesting because the question's about finding affluence in the black community. And when I look through photographs, I can see people who are refined and dressed well and poised, but often the real success stories are people who ended up going to New York City. You know, I haven't found necessarily wealthy, local black success stories, but I can point to ones in New York City, like the Fraser family, for example, who went away. But that is a good question, and I can't say that anything jumps to mind, because your point is good about black-owned businesses like banks or insurance companies. Gaius Boland was the first black lawyer in Poughkeepsie in the early 1900s, so he became wealthy. He had a nice house on Grand Avenue in Poughkeepsie. So I'm sure there are other examples by the 20th century. How are we doing on time? Oh, time flies. I'll just show you a couple of other examples. Poring over the property deeds. This one is dated 1868, so just after the Civil War. And it says, in November, between Ruth Vangeline of the town of Washington on the first part, and Stephen Willits of the same place on the second part, witness, and she sells a small part of land that is described as beginning in a locust hub, as they always are, at the corner of land belonging to the Dutchess County Poorhouse. It might even say Poorhouse Farm. And we found another piece of property that was adjacent, and it seems like adjacent to the poorhouse there might have been some small lots where blacks lived, but I don't think that was necessarily where the kind of rougher images that we saw were taking place. We need more work on census records, which are good because they're sequential, right? But I found on a map where this land is, because you can see on an 1876 map, the land, which has a D, the other a G, and Stephen Willits are just there, adjacent to the county poorhouse. noticeably along the railroad tracks, right? So that would be interesting to learn more about. And they're both black, Stephen Willits and Ruth Vangeline. And the interesting thing about Stephen Willits is that he served in the Navy in the Civil War on the U.S. steamer Cimarron. So there's a story of a town of Washington veteran and hero that would be interesting, because those were certainly the early days of steam in the Civil War. So those are a couple of examples. The Benson Lossing House in Dover is worth a mention because of these diaries of the son. This is from the county collections. Benson Lossing, a local man who became famous for his historical work and kind of set the standard for the study of American history and the publishing of American history, and was an enormous collector of source material and original source material. So his work is often highly regarded and very well respected. And among the items in this Lossing collection at the County Historical Society is a map drawn by the son showing the Lossing House here, and then a lot of the activity that he describes is south of that. Oh, I'm sorry, here's the ridge. This is the main house, I'm sorry. And to help you understand where that is today, Chestnut Ridge, south and east, right? And this is what it looks like today. But I want to, when you read the postcards at the Millbrook Historical Society, there are a lot of Duncans. And it turns out that there were a lot of Duncans and Johnsons in Chestnut Hill. And when you read about these, you read some amazing stories about that family. But this maybe gives a snapshot as good as any about what Chestnut Ridge was like in the 1870s. He's writing about the period of the 1870s. Down below Ann Wings, further in the mountain, at the intersection of Stearns Road, a little grass road that branched off from their main highway, there lived an old slave by the name of Jackie Duncan. Now, what we know about Jackie Duncan from the Millbrook Historical Society collection is that he was the grandfather of John Britton's wife, and that as a young boy he was bought and enslaved. He was brought from New York City and enslaved. So Lossing goes on to say he was not related to the Duncan boys that had worked for us. His wife and son Amos showed real Indian blood. I'd just say that's another thing you run into much more than we realize is the intersection with indigenous people. Jackie was as black as he could be. I never heard how all these colored people came to this locality, but I assume it was through the Underground Railroad during the Civil War. And just above this locality, many Quakers are settled. And the only thing I'd say is his speculation there is largely right, that the majority are going to be Underground Railroad freedom seekers, but we know from the testimony of John Britton's son that this particular Jackie Duncan was bought as an enslaved boy in New York City and brought to the town of Washington. So it is 8 o'clock almost, so shall I just point out a couple of other people. In the southeast of town, you have an Andrew Frazier, who's the grandson of a Revolutionary War veteran, Andrew Frazier, who's buried in Rhinebeck. And this Frazier's niece, Susan Elizabeth Frazier, became the first black teacher allowed to teach white students in New York City. She was the head of she formed the Women's Auxiliary of the Harlem Hellfighters. When she died in the 1920s, she was given a military funeral, and she's buried in Rhinebeck. So the Frazier family, of which you are lucky to have one, is part of this larger network. I think this says it all. These are memorials for the great-grandfather Andrew in the Revolutionary War, Jerome in the Civil War, another Jerome in the First World War, Susan Elizabeth Fraser in the First, and James Fraser buried in Poughkeepsie in World War II. So that is quite a respectable track record of veteran service. There's Susan Elizabeth Fraser. I'll just see if there are a couple of other little things and then wrap up. I talked about John Britton. This is a picture from the Millbrook Historical Society. And I believe the top says, Mr. Greenwood, June 24th, 2009. Dear Mr. Greenwood, I have a picture, blah, blah. So we're grateful for all the records that we have that tell us the story of John Britton's coming from Tennessee after the war and having a productive life here. This is a picture. John Britton is on the horse. And then this is kind of how we know so much about the family, through these handwritten notes and obituaries and other work that we've done. Well, this is the story of the Brown brothers, maybe for another day. By looking at census records, I was able to find the ancestor of that woman in Australia. By the way, she is coming from Australia in about 6 weeks, and she wants to come to the town of Washington and Millbrook and see where her ancestors lived, and we will be taking her just south of here toward the Unionvale border. And even though the Brown brothers don't show up because they were too poor, their house might not have been so spectacular, we can tell from the census, which recorded everyone, that their houses were somewhere in here. And one of the Browns is named Duncan Brown, so the family name Duncan is. These are the two brothers, and this is a descendant in Australia named Abraham Lincoln Brown. So maybe we'll have that. Anyway, more and more information about the Duncans, and I have to put in a plug for this. I've been very excited about studying the 200th anniversary of the visit of the Marquis de Lafayette, which will be September 16th for Poughkeepsie. And I've been working on a story about who was in the audience when Lafayette came in 1824, because he was 19 in the Revolutionary War. So by 1824, there weren't that many left. He had record crowds, and I thought, record crowds, who was in the crowd? And how did they view him? And it's particularly interesting when you look at how blacks viewed him, because he was a very aggressive abolitionist and publicly critical of the United States for not doing away with slavery. But you had, again, among the wonderful people who had at one point lived in the town of Washington, is Lafayette Williams. So a free black couple in 1827, the year slavery was abolished, chose to name their son Lafayette Williams. And as maybe not surprising, he goes on to serve in the Civil War and is killed and is buried in the South in the National Cemetery. Also, his son, and if you believe the census records, the son, again from Washington, enlisted in the Civil War in 1864 at the age of 13. And is also died and is buried in the National Cemetery. And then I have some other examples which maybe I think might be for another day, and then I'll trade questions. Oh, I had so much. We could be here for hours. Here we go. Thanks a lot. Yes, sir.
Lafayette was in this area, and he passed through Armenia, and De Laverne there, who was a doctor, organized a regimental unit. And people living in Armenia were thrown out of the town if they didn't pay this rather heavy tax for the revolution. I live now in northern Burbank, on Burbank Village Road, and there's an old decrepit tavern there from the Revolutionary time. And it's said that Lafayette did once sleep there. youth in the area of recruiting. And the town of Lagrange is actually named after
Yes.
Lafayette because that was the name of Lafayette's farm.
That's right, in
And most
France.
of the people in Lagrange think it's named after the American Grange Organization, which didn't exist back then. But in the
correct.
courtroom there, they have the coat of arms of Lafayette behind the judge.
Oh, a very
Yeah.
nice touch.
Right.
And again, because you're so familiar with the Quaker population and philosophy, the mayor of Poughkeepsie was a Quaker and not so sure how to handle Lafayette, and he ended up loading his 4 white horses to carry, but he didn't greet Lafayette at the foot of Main Street, and actually may have been hesitant to invite him, and it's believed because of the military aspects, he was uncomfortable with the celebration of this military dimension.
And Lafayette, after the war, made an agreement with Washington. He bought a large tract of land in
Yes.
North and South America and New Guinea. And he had a program whereby he bought slaves and they could work for 5 years for them. And if he had no problem with them, he got papers for them and they shipped them to the United States and they became American citizens just before the Civil War.
Lafayette was good with following up his words with actions.
Well,
Other questions?
I have one question.
Yes.
What is the Red Summer?
Oh, the Red Summer
I never
was,
heard of it.
yeah, 1919, and there is an interesting open letter from Gaius Bolin. Gaius Bolin's father grew up in Dover, almost on the Connecticut border, I think, escaped from New Jersey. Anyway, first black graduate of Williams College, first black lawyer in Dutchess County. And the blacks were recruited separately. Of course, we did not have an integrated military until 1948, right? So they were recruited separately. They were put under the command of who would be Congressman Fish, Hamilton Fish, and were sent to France, and Pershing did not want them. So they served under the French. And they ended up serving with great distinction and award and length and tenure and success. But General Pershing did not want blacks, even in a separate unit, fighting in the United States Army. So they used French weapons. They were supported by the French. As I say, came back highly decorated. They come back, though, in the war. It kind of ends in 1918. And in 1919, all across the country, blacks are attacked violently and killed across the country in racist attacks. And, that said a lot about their reception on their way home, on their way back.
Yeah.
And Bill, if I can just add to that, there's certain years in American history where it seems like things are just kind of going off the rails. 1919 is one of those years, because not only is it the end of World War I, but there's the Spanish influenza in 1918, kind of going into 1919. There are more strikes and more workers on strike in 1919 than any other year in American history. So I would compare it to like 1968, right? And the Vietnam War and the assassinations. Maybe 2020 and into early 2021, where it seems like things are kind of coming apart to a degree. It's just kind of one of those years where the center doesn't hold.
We have a wonderful picture of Franklin Roosevelt marching briskly down Main Street, Poughkeepsie, in the celebratory end of World War I. He was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and of course in 1920 he was the vice presidential candidate. He was just felt certain that he had been the Assistant Secretary of the Navy through the war, victorious. Of course, Cox was running for president, he'd be vice president. They lost, right, to the conservatives, Calvin Coolidge and Harding. And so it was a disruptive time when all that energy into the war, and what happened during the war? Women got the right to vote nationally. Prohibition happened. Blacks, not so much. Progress, and then of course, prohibition was nothing but an unraveling after that. But those were the days when we had constitutional amendments. I sometimes think we need a few more.
Well, do you guys have plans for the anniversary of Lafayette's visit? Is there stuff in the works to commemorate it in September, or?
I am, I'm giving 4 classes on Lafayette through the Bard Lifetime Learning Institute, but the real event is on September 16th on the anniversary at Poughkeepsie's Locust Grove. I'm giving a talk, we're having a lunch, and it's going to be part of the American Friends of Lafayette, who are organizing a complete recreation of following his footsteps day to day. So they'll be in Poughkeepsie, and then they're stopping at Montgomery Place. We're organizing something because Lafayette visited Janet Montgomery. They're stopping at Claremont, where there was a ball. They're going to Albany, they're coming back. And then on the 19th in Fishkill, there's this extraordinary desk that was, the oral tradition was the desk was given by Lafayette in 1824 to the Brinkerhoffs as a thank you for his, the family taking care of him. But it was only an oral tradition until a couple months ago when we found the label, the manufacturer's label, and could confirm that it was from 1824. And so it's kind of cool when an oral history matches. So the group that's doing the national tour is going to also, which you can see anytime at the Van Wyck House, this desk that Montgomery, that Lafayette gave to the Brinkerhoff family.
First, I want to thank you for this wonderful presentation. It was really well done. I'm interested in your methodology. You're such a great researcher. Do you just have a topic, or do you just start pouring over documents upon documents, and hopefully you find the caveat, the diamond in the rough? Or
that's a good
how
question.
do you usually style your methods of research?
That's a good question. I mean, I think I have some general questions or straw man suppositions which I'm willing to give up, but then I descend into a rabbit hole where there's no light and you're just grabbing fact by fact, and then I have to step back and look for the connections. Like I found the connection between the Fowler interviews, the Lossings and the script, and the Historical Society. So it's kind of a down in the weeds, get the relevant things, and you will always bump into an adjacent fact that could open up a whole other avenue, and then you have to come up with for air.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned the one in Milan. Are there any black burial grounds in the town of Washington?
Oh, so the question was, are there black burial grounds in the town of Washington? I don't know if there are. There are the ones that I am aware of. There's what's called a Storm Slave Cemetery in East Fishkill. There's the cemetery in Milan. We've identified 2 in Red Hook. There's one on Osborne Hill Road, where there was also an A&E Zion Church. But I don't know that we found one in Washington.
Yeah, I mean, so the major cemetery in Millbrook, right, is the one by the Quaker Meeting House. And I think because that's a Quaker cemetery, it was kind of less racially exclusive.
It's very unusual, but you're right. You're absolutely right.
So I mean, it's from a little bit of a later period, but I mean, a lot of like the Duncan, Anthony family stuff that you showed, John Britton is buried in that cemetery.
But part of the problem you had is that, like in Milan, either there were discrete cemeteries, most people were buried on their house lot. That's how that small black cemetery started that I talked about. But at Yeoman Cemetery, there was a southeast section for blacks, but they weren't allowed permanent memorials. They could have a wooden cross, but nothing permanent. So you end up really having a hard time figuring it out unless you have ground penetrating radar, which some professors have done, like in Rhinebeck and in Hyde Park. So they can be hard to find because they're not really identified to be
There's
memorialized.
also a colored section in the St. Peter's Cemetery in Lithgow.
That's interesting. Do you know how?
Just a few.
Yeah,
Just a few.
yeah.
It's recorded.
Because there's an example in Red Hook where a wealthy family took their servant, black servant, with them in their family plot, and I can think of one example in Rhinebeck where they're usually separate.
So you mentioned lifetime learning. I belong to CLS, it's associated with Marist College.
Yeah,
We're taking a class right now in slavery in Dutchess
with
County.
Peter Bunton.
Huh?
With Peter Bunton, and you just saw the New Guinea exhibition, and you saw the artifacts that,
How'd you know that?
the Historical Society, we are the guardians of the New Guinea artifacts for Hyde Park, for the town of Hyde Park.
One thing that came out, you didn't mention, was that let me see your moment here.
That's all right. Related to New Guinea in Hyde Park?
No, related to slave ownership.
Oh,
By the Quakers, yes. The Quakers did own slaves early on, and then of course they became abolitionists.
yeah. I think that's, the manumission documents we found in 1776 were to take effect in 20 years later or so. It was kind of the pace of it, it wasn't that it wasn't happening, it's just that it wasn't instant anywhere. Oh, someone in the back? Oh, hi.
Does the Dutchess County Historical Society hold most or a lot of Benson Lossing's collection, like correspondence or anything?
Oh, the question was about what we have related to Benson Lossing. We have some photographs. It's not a lot. Like, we have a lot of his books, but they weren't owned by him. I wouldn't say we have a lot. We have a handful of photographs, and we have some interesting engravings done by his daughter, I think it is, right? So there's like a smattering. It gives you a sense. They kind of take place around the house, gives you a sense. But I think the real gem, I printed out the transcript from Thomas Sweet Lossing, and it's that thick, and he covers a lot of different things. It's a real interesting...
Thicker than the book then. There's more in it than the book that was...
Yeah, I was reading just from the colored section, which is maybe a fifth of it. Yeah.
Is your contact through the Dutchess County Historical Society?
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
thank you.
yes.
There's such a wealth of information in the slides, and we didn't get to everything, and I was just wondering if you have plans to collect any of this into a book or any kind of...
Oh, that's a good question. The question is whether to put it into it. It's a good question. I also see you have the Northern Dutchess News. I've been writing an article every other week for the Northern Dutchess News for 5 years. I keep thinking sometimes I should assemble that. But it's a good question I have to think about, is how we make this information more accessible and I was going to say collaboratable, but you know what I mean. Because so many of these things, like it was a talk on the New Guinea community in Bridgeport, Connecticut, that opened my eyes to the whole question of the maritime dynamics. And once I started looking into that, there were very obvious connections. So it's a good question to have the information, because you also want to share it so other people can kind of be inspired by it or connect dots themselves. So it's a good question I haven't totally figured out. Anyone else?
Well, I mean, if this talk served no other purpose, I think everyone here got a sense of all of the incredibly vital work that Bill and the Dutchess County Historical Society are doing. And I'm sure you would love people to sign up to be members.
Oh, yes.
Right? I'm assuming everyone's here a member of the Millbrook Historical Society, I hope. Right? He's signing up to be a member of the Dutchess County Historical Society as well. I have cookies that I made over here, if people would like one. They're peanut butter, so warning, right? Everybody's allergic. But let's thank Bill again for...
I can say, on Saturday, if you're in Millbrook, we're having an open house at new headquarters between 2 and 5:30. We are in the Hobson's Appliance Building, formerly, a mile south of Rhinebeck, so Saturday, 2 to 5.
Yes, and then you're going to be having the opening of the firefighters exhibit. That's what I'm...
Oh, yeah.